Okay, so I thought, given our conversations on Messenger, that it might be helpful if I just tried to give you a visual of the different um, interests of biblical scholars, because I think it might be easier to explain this way. So we'll see. You can let me know after you watch this if this was helpful to clarifying. So it sounds like the two of you are really into, at the moment, this element or this layer of biblical studies that's called text criticism. And that is, of course, when we're talking about a given book, whether it's the book of Genesis or the Gospel of Matthew, or maybe even one of Paul's letters, then we're talking about how we got a particular, a particular book or letter. And it also includes, the conversations today in translation committees where we have multiple copies of a particular passage or a particular book, and there are some differences there. Which of those differences wins in terms of the one they trust for their translation into the Bible? So it sounds like this is where you guys are interested, and there are a lot of really fascinating conversations that do take place at this level. I absolutely agree with that. Agree that there's things to get caught up in and just really find interesting, and just to mull it over, and the impact of those choices can be quite far-reaching. So I can appreciate that. There's another level of biblical studies referred to as canon criticism, and that is when we talk about the books that do end up in the Christian Bible itself, right? There are some that were left out, that were up for debate, for instance, or were up for consideration. So some people want to talk about that, and not only why were some left out, and why were the ones that were put in chosen, but also how then that we have this collection, what's the best way to understand the collection, and how does it inform itself, right? Are there the books in one testament informing the books in the other testament? How does that work? What's the best way to do that? So when you have this collective, how do we best make sense of it? Is perhaps one way to talk about canon criticism, but also, this applies at the level of talking about the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh. Those three sections, you can talk about when those three sections were decided upon and closed. When was the Newer Testament canon closed? And the conversations that went into it. So there are all kinds of pieces. You can get into more narrow elements of each of these if you want. The realm of historical criticism is absolutely essential, I think, to understanding the Bible today. And so it becomes, from my perspective, foundational to talking about the Bible in our current contexts, what you do with it, how you make sense of it, right? So this is the level of talking about, I realized I could have put so many more different images here, but religiously speaking, what are the different religions that are influencing, or that are perhaps people are taking parts of to incorporate into the practices that we end up getting in Judaism and Christianity. So I have Asherah and Baal here, but I could have had some images of Roman emperors, because they are a form of worship or veneration that is relevant in the conversation in Newer Testament texts. We could talk about, there are many other gods that aren't specifically addressed, but who actually have influence, in particular in the Newer Testament. We have political elements and people that represent those political entities, but all the different things that go along with this, right? So the stela here of Hammurabi, right, and the codes, the Code of Hammurabi. So all kinds of elements of other nations or entities and their influence on what ends up being a part of the Christian Bible. So empires, people groups, their understanding of how the world works, right? It shows up from cover to cover, right? The things that we can pick up in terms of sociological insights. What kinds of things do we see about gender roles, or about families, or about so forth and so on? So lots to work with here. Many elements of this in terms of what historical criticism is doing and why it is important in biblical studies today. Then we get to this element that I'm summarizing as church history and theology, which is, they each have their own large segment of scholarship and study and so forth. But church history and theology go hand in hand in this particular framework or this particular conversation, right? We have 19 centuries of primarily men, but not only, but people studying the texts that we have, making decisions about how to interpret them, passing along those traditional meanings to the next generations. People creating doctrines, which usually start with some sort of passage in the Bible, but not always. And so decisions that are made about the church, the beliefs of people within the church, then those doctrines then inform the way you read. And so it becomes this, these things inform one another, right? Of course, we have missions didn't start right away, but we do have several centuries of missionary work and preaching that has happened throughout the centuries. We even have sermons from the late 2nd century that some people are still using, and ideas that come out of some of these sermons over the centuries that become incredibly important or informative, and some of them in positive ways and some of them in quite harmful ways. So there's a realm of study referred to as church history and separately theology that is connected to the Bible, and more than that, it informs how people read the Bible. And then what I've done on this slide is I've taken the picture of the previous slide and put that, that's where we're starting with. Then there's this element of how is this content, the almost 2 millennia of tradition and doctrine and interpretations that are handed down, how is that content then taught in seminaries, which then, of course, informs how those people in seminaries who go on to become pastors, how are they then teaching it and preaching it in their to their congregations, and what kinds of Bible studies are they leading? How are they handling the content of the Bible when they do? What I think is really interesting is, as a college professor, is how any of this is taught to children, and this being the Bible part, but you can't get from just the Bible to the children. You have this all these years and layers, right, are a part of what you end up teaching children. And which parts of the Bible do you even choose to teach to children? And when I get students in my biblical studies courses, most of them, not all, but most of them are operating out of a version of the stories they were taught as children and not one that you would teach to an adult. And in fact, many adults are still operating out of that same framework. They haven't been given an adult or more informed perspective on the scriptures. And so I just find that interesting. Now, where I come into the conversation, along with many of my colleagues, is I like to bring to bear my own realities and the questions that my experiences have pushed me to raise. So it isn't perhaps as important at the level of text criticism. I think the way a feminist lens is most important at this level is asking who is telling the stories to begin with. Whose stories are we collecting as a book or letter? How are women or minorities of various kinds, right, being described? How are they depicted in the texts that we are choosing to read? So then you can raise a conversation. Similar thing here at the level of canon criticism. Who was invited to the party that made the decision about what made it into the canon? Whose books were being up for debate in that canon? And you can raise questions about power and authority, which for me as a feminist, are pretty important questions, right, at each level as well, in particular when it comes to things like canon or the church history and theology. So I raise feminists, I bring in my particular realities as a woman and the questions that my experiences have caused me to raise to historical criticism. So it isn't just that we have these ideas that we are working with. I'm going to raise questions about who told you so, whose lens is telling me about the empires and the people groups. What, are these male-centered questions and claims and observations and assertions? So there are questions to raise at every level, every step of the historical endeavor of the Bible and the interpretations of the Bible that we've been handed, right? Certainly within church history and theology, and I tend to get tripped up over theology in particular because it's kind of tangentially related to the Bible, but people have made some pretty definitive claims in terms of theology, and so the questions of authority and power are, very important to me to raise in the realm of theology. How is the God being described and defined? Whose words get to count as appropriate or correct? Whose understandings of reality and God and humans? All kinds of things come into play in this conversation. And then, of course, at this level, questions of how are you teaching the tradition? Are you reading with the grain of tradition, or are you raising questions about the grain of tradition in this process to get from what we have and who has defined what we have? Who has told the history of the church, right? Whose version of events is being canonized as the church history even? And therefore, who's being left out of that story? So how is this being taught in seminaries? Are people being taught to read with the grain of what they've been taught, or are they being challenged and encouraged to raise questions about what has been handed down to them, and so forth and so on? So there are reasons why, for instance, when people get to seminary, they have a hard time hearing about some of the history because they haven't been given it as children or even as adults. And this raises really interesting questions about how we're teaching in seminaries and which questions are we teaching pastors to raise so that they will teach their people in the pews to raise these questions from, so forth, from a young age. Anyway, so I am most interested in, now that we have this book called the Bible, what ways do we see it still playing out and affecting people? When you have a particular passage and it is, can we look at a passage that is thoroughly patriarchal and is incredibly harmful for, let's say, non-binary identifying people? I just lost my train of thought when I went into that realm because I was thinking of men and women. But when there's a story that's harmful in some sort of a way, right? Do we have space to raise a question and challenge that story? When we're reading the story accurately, right? Is there a way for someone do people have the tools they need to challenge the harmfulness of a passage within their faith communities? That's what I'm up to, is that kind of an engagement with the scriptures. So I hope this was helpful. We'll see,